Not every donor prospect needs to receive every email. And that most especially applies to the major donors.
I'm Eric Wilson, managing partner of Startup Caucus, the home of campaign tech innovation on the right. Welcome to the Business of Politics show. On this podcast, you're joining in on a conversation with entrepreneurs, operatives, and experts who make professional politics happen. Today, we're welcoming Dante Vitagliano back to the show. He's the founder of Trailmapper, whose software helps Republican campaigns upgrade their major donor fundraising program. We last spoke to Dante in November 2021, and you can listen to that episode via the link in our show notes. In this episode, we're getting caught up on his progress, hearing his lessons learned, and sharing advice for new entrepreneurs. Dante, welcome back. It's been about a year and a half since we last had you on the show. So give our listeners a bit of an update on Trailmapper and what it is you've been working on.
Yeah, it's been a while. It's crazy. I can't believe how fast it went. Since we last talked, we had our product, Prospector Pro, in the market for a full election cycle now. So our focus now is on version 2, which means we're distilling down the learnings from the dozens of users and hundreds of thousands of data points that we collected in 2022 to continue to build a better product.
And remind folks or maybe introduce for the first time what Prospector Pro does.
Yeah, Prospector Pro is a major donor fundraising operating system. So we call it the SWAS model, software with a service. We help connect candidates, campaigns, principals of organizations, nonprofits, trade associations, and advocacy groups with the funders, the major givers, who are going to be most likely to be receptive to their message. So we have software and data. If you think about sort of a Venn diagram with 3 circles, like software, data, and services, we're kind of at the intersection of those 3.
Got it. So just so folks understand, this is not about online fundraising, even though it's a cloud-based application. This is more of your donors who you need to build a relationship with, that you need to contact and reach out to.
The very first thing I tell every new customer when we talk to them for the first time and demo the product is, the first thing you should know is that this is a major donor fundraising product. We focus on people who give $1,000 or more, and typically have given $15,000 at a minimum of the past 3 cycles. So major donor fundraising is obviously very different from a small dollar. There's a different approach, different strategy, different tack you have to take with converting major donors. So that's the area that we focus on. We found that this was the area of sort of modern campaigning that was most in need of innovation. And so that's where we're focused.
Do you have a hard time kind of breaking out of those expectations? I find this as someone who worked in digital marketing for a long time for campaigns. When I go to talk to them about software and other things, they think, oh, this is a digital thing. It has nothing to do with field or finance or political or comms. Do you have that challenge when you're reaching out to campaigns?
I think the biggest challenge is educating them on the distinction between the two. There are tried and true methods that work in the digital space and small dollar space that simply don't work for major donor fundraising. So distinguishing between the two, I find that our users are often confused. They think one message or strategy or tactic, it works for small dollar, so it will work for the major donors, and that's just not the case.
Yeah.
It's a very different audience that we're talking to, and we're actually making very different asks. The difference between a $25 ask and a $2,500 ask is a couple zeros. That's no joke.
We've had a number of conversations on this show about the grassroots small dollar fundraising problems that Republicans are facing. But since you're focused on the other end of that spectrum, what is the outlook there? Are we seeing similar donor fatigue? Are they tired of some of the tactics that are being used?
Without a doubt. We collect a lot of data. We have lots of conversations with the funders that our users are connecting with and asking for contributions. And almost universally, donors are tired of the deluge of texts and emails. But as far as solutions go, many of the digital practitioners, if you will, that you've talked to on this show, they've been at least from my perspective, spot on in their recommendations, which I think namely is just segmenting your lists. Like, I've heard on your show, not every donor prospect needs to receive every email. And that most especially applies to the major donors with whom you're trying to build meaningful relationships, getting them to part with, 4 or 5 figures of their hard earned money and, potentially host an event, introduce you to their friends and family and bundle some checks together. So I certainly wouldn't want to encourage any of our users to use the same strategy. So major donors are accustomed to giving $1,000 checks, but they're not going to respond the same way to the same sort of emotionally charged appeals that a small dollar giver might. So I think it comes down to data management.
Yeah. Well, I think it also has a lot to do with, your understanding their motivations. Why are they giving? Is it to build these relationships? Is it to go into these fundraisers? Is it to be able to maintain your business ties with someone who's running, that you may know professionally? The other end of it, of course, is from a campaign perspective of looking past the dollar figure for a supporter. We're obviously focused on voters. We're focused on donors. We're focused on volunteers. I think a lot of times campaigns don't realize that those can all be the same people. And to your point, yes, someone maxes out. Well, they can also bundle, they can host, they can recruit new people. Really valuable stuff that if you didn't have software like this to manage those relationships more effectively, you'd be missing out on.
I think the key here for us, and especially this cycle, our priority has been the meaningful relationships at scale, and with an emphasis on the meaningful relationships aspect of it. There's I think in the professionalization of campaigning, we've built great products that allow you to scale outreach infinitely, and we want to build meaningful relationships at scale, but not scale at all costs. If there's one thing that we've learned about the major donor population over the past 2 years collecting all this data, is that it's a really unsatisfying insight, which is that every donor is different. I think we get a lot of questions about like what are donors thinking about these days, and or what are the top issues. But every donor is different. The way they like to be communicated with is different. Their priorities are different. Their expectations, their motivations, their attitudes, preferences, all of those things, everyone's different. So being able to construct a strategy that is generally applicable across the major donor population that you're prospecting from is important, but then also having the tools and capability to drill down and get more specific for individual donors. And so if for example, this guy's a big texter, he's not trying to take, phone calls. There's plenty of donors who've never had a conversation with any one of our users on the phone, but they have communicated via text and they give. And, to me, that seems kind of weird, but, to them, obviously that's their preference. And there are, other donors who they have completely different motivations. Sometimes they just want to be heard. Sometimes they want to test your issue positions and see if they're aligned. But not every donor has the same sort of motivation. So we want to craft a strategy that is generally applicable, but then also can be adapted to specific sub audiences, and then even more specifically to individual donors. Treating them like human beings is really what it comes down to, as opposed to ATMs.
Dante, I want to shift gears now and talk more about the business and the process of building Trailmapper. So what's been the most surprising challenge that you've encountered while scaling since we talked to you 18 months ago?
Well, this isn't really a technical challenge or a business challenge per se, but one thing that we have been focusing a lot lately has been how do we build a product that encourages our users to step outside their comfort zone. If left to their own devices, most candidates are going to come up with a platform that is generally in a message that's really similar to everybody else out there. And I wouldn't say that major donor fundraising is quite a zero-sum game. It's not like that, but it is competitive. And every user on our platform is effectively competing for donations with the other thousands upon thousands of people running for office up and down the ballot. So, breaking through the noise is particularly important. Obviously, you want to capture interest, inspire, and motivate people, but it needs to be unique. And so, building product around that has been a challenge. What can we do on the product side to encourage our users to think differently and not just fall into that same sort of mindset of the quote unquote smile and dial? Smile and dial is this phrase that has been repeated in political fundraising for ages, and it implies you have to just put your nose down, nose to the grindstone, and just call. It's a numbers game only. Well, is it? Or can we be more efficient, right? Can we be more effective?
Well, it goes to this problem or this challenge of expanding the pie, right? So that process works for a certain group of donors, but it's not going to bring people who necessarily are unique to you, like your network or people who are excited about your campaign. The same thing that we deal with on the online grassroots fundraising, which is, if you could block off the logo and the paid for on most campaign fundraising emails, it could come from any campaign out there. There's just no unique brand to it.
Right. And I don't see how that type of message is going to distinguish you from the other guy also asking the same people for money. The major donor population in the US is relatively small.
And so if campaigns don't have this unique brand, it's really hard to stand out.
That's absolutely right. And one thing that we've been working on is trying to tease out those unique aspects. Every user on our platform is different too. And sometimes we'll learn 2-3 months into an engagement with a user on our platform that they were a game show contestant and they won a bunch of money. Well, I mean, that's interesting. That's unique. That's different. We had another user who it took us several months before he revealed that he was at ground zero, digging people out, looking for survivors, and 9/11. It's like, how did you not mention that yet? This is not something that everyone can say. Everyone can say what their issue positions are. Oh, I want to lower taxes, reduce the size and scope of this federal government. Sure, I mean, so did the rest of us. What makes you unique? Put your mind in the major donor's shoes. What can you do to distinguish yourself from the crowd?
You've got a much larger team now, Dante, than when we first spoke. And from a mindset shift, how do you take that leap from it just being you and maybe some contractors to help you with the software to having real employees, having to maintain a payroll? Because that is one of those 0 to 1 type moments in a startup that I think is challenging for a lot of people to overcome.
Well, we're a fully distributed team, so that presents its own set of challenges. Many of our employees across the country never met. In fact, just a few weeks ago in DC, I got to meet some people who had been working with us for better part of a year and a half to 2 years for the first time. It was really cool. I know it's super buzzwordy, but things like creating company culture, distributing knowledge and resources across the company, and then aligning the team around company objectives, those are challenges that we face every day. Distributing responsibility. When you grow, or at least in our experience, you go from having tasks to complete to having teams responsible for tasks. So for me, my job is less about getting things done and more focused on just empowering the teams within the organization to get their job done effectively. Do they have the tools and resources? And how can we do things more effectively, make their lives easier? Also, quality control, it has emerged as a new focus. I kind of think about it in terms of like Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And I'm not sure that if that's a great analogy, but once your basic needs are met, which for us means, is the product working as intended, right? Bare minimum, expectation. And beyond that, it's once those needs are met, now you can start thinking about optimization, thinking about improvements, iterating, and making the product more effective, easier to use, a better experience for the customer. So those are some of the main challenges that we face as we continue to grow. But
so it's kind of like you're shifting from being, a performer to being the conductor of the orchestra, right? You're not actually making the music, but you're making sure that everyone else is.
It's a challenge for some, for at least I can, speaking for myself, for folks that have thrived in the performer role,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like when you take full responsibility over your domain and whatever is under your responsibility, to just making sure that the trains run on time and everybody has the tools that they need. So there's an infrastructure around internal communications that we have to build. We're thinking a lot about collaboration, and I know we're treading into the buzzwordy uh, territory here again, but you eventually realize that there's a reason that these big companies use so many buzzwords. Is because that these are the challenges that they face. How do we standardize information and documentation across the organization? How do we make sure that everyone's aligned and that we're all rowing in the same direction? I think one thing that we've done really well is instill in our team this core value of collecting feedback, collecting data, and collecting data generally, collecting data within our product, collecting data from our customers, and listening to our customers. That's something that is pervasive at all levels of the company, from our CSRs to our leadership team, even on the development side, the technical team, all focused on taking user feedback to help build a better product.
You're listening to the Business of Politics show. I'm speaking with Dante Vitagliano, founder of Trailmapper. One of the things that Trailmapper devotes a lot of time and resources to is creating content. You've got an active blog, you make videos, you talked about your survey data. Why is that so important to the company?
Yeah, well, first of all, thanks for appreciating that, because it's not a lot. It's a good amount of work. It requires attention, and which is a
Well, yeah, I
valuable
mean,
resource.
you don't have to tell me. I've got the podcast and the newsletter and all that.
I don't envy you, and that's one of the reasons why I haven't committed myself to a proper podcast. Although we do try to host podcast style conversations to have interesting back and forth with people, but content marketing really just kind of aligns with our core values. One of them being transparency. As a lifelong campaigner, the majority of my professional career has been on the other side of the desk, as it were, right? And one thing that always sort of irritated me about the industry is how cagey everyone is.
Right.
Everyone just seems to play really close to the vest. And we don't take that position. We try and do the opposite. We try and share our learning, share our experience and our insight. Ultimately, it helps our customers. And frankly, as a new company, we know that it's our job to build trust with the community that we serve. So producing content that users and potential users hopefully find valuable, it just sort of makes sense.
And it has to help you with customer discovery, right? Like, people will find you from that.
Absolutely. I think there's also the novelty aspect, how our offering is differentiated from existing alternatives in long form content. It's really kind of hard to explain to somebody. That's why I always kind of bristle when someone says, "Give me your elevator pitch." It's like, yeah, well, I mean, it's major donor fundraising, but just less miserable, right? And that's not super satisfying. That's not super informative. But the long form content allows us to better explain what differentiates our product from the existing alternatives. So it's been fantastic strategy from a user acquisition perspective, for sure.
Well, I mean, that's one of the pieces of advice that I give to people who are coming into this market, where you've got people who are decision makers who are very busy. You're right. There's not a lot of content out there about our profession. And so it really is, if you're trying to build something and you want to make it past the inbox, filters, the gatekeepers, creating content that's valuable and interesting to your target audience is the way to go. What are some other piece of advice? What's some other advice that you would share to other prospective entrepreneurs or people who are early in their journey, about maybe a mistake that you should have seen or wish you'd have seen and avoided?
everyone always says talk to customers, but I would take it a step further and say don't make excuses when it comes to user feedback. So when
Okay.
you're when every piece of feedback, whether you have to take the emotion out of it, you are not the product, right? As a team member in a startup, the product is, in some ways it is a reflection of your work, but you have to divorce those two things, because the feedback, regardless of whether you feel on an emotional level that it's warranted or valid, it has to come from somewhere. So, look past the words which may offend you or irritate you, and think about what is the problem that they're trying to solve that they don't feel like is being solved, and how do you improve the product to make that better. So not making excuses. Prioritizing user feedback is, sort of it's trite at this point. Everyone knows that you have to do that. You have to listen to customers.
Well, they
But
they know that you've got to do it, but it's hard to do. And honestly, one of the challenges that we face in our industry is you don't get that many bites at the apple reputationally for getting user feedback. There are probably only a handful of people that you and I work with who, if we screwed up royally, would give us a second chance. And so I do think there's a
right.
little bit of tension and reputational risk there, but that's really the only way you're going to break through.
I think you have to be a little bit more resilient when taking on reputational risk, because you're never going to learn if you're not putting the product in users' hands to start getting feedback. And a customer churning is not the end of the world.
Mm-hmm.
As long as you're directionally correct, as long as you're moving in the right direction, as long as you've learned something from that experience, and you're making the product better so that you can increase retention, reduce your overall churn, and serve customers better, so that the better experience that they get, the more likely they're going to stay.
Yeah, another area in startups and particularly this industry that involves a lot of learning is pricing. It's a big question that entrepreneurs are always asking me, and my advice is put something down on paper, get customers to respond to it. If they say, "Hey, look, I really want to use your software, but this is a problem for us on the pricing front," then they've now just told you how to price your product. So that's where you want to get to. What was your product pricing journey like? Getting to something that really worked for users for Trailmapper.
Yeah, it has been a journey, absolutely. And you could throw something down on paper and then adapt from there, and that's essentially what we did. When we first rolled out Prospector Pro, we threw down what we thought was a no-brainer pricing model, and I suppose it was similar to like a cost plus strategy, in terms of it's basically the lowest cost that we could financially stomach, because frankly, we needed the new users
Right.
so that we could start getting feedback. And we quickly transitioned to something more like a hybrid between a competitive pricing model and a value-based pricing model, with competitive pricing meaning tailoring your price versus existing alternatives,
Right.
and then the value-based pricing being how well the solution at its current price meets the needs of our users. So for our users, the priority is cash on hand. At least for our product, the priority, what they're looking to get out of it, is cash on hand, and not just total dollars raised. If your goal is just the raw number in terms of what you get to report at the end of the quarter, then there are other solutions like digital that could potentially be a better fit if you don't care about how much cash you actually have in the
Right.
bank.
You don't care about net. Yeah.
So with that priority, that's what has made our pricing model what it is today. We do offer custom pricing, but we have a tiered pricing model that can accommodate the needs of each different type of user. So sort of scaling down, down ballot, mid tier races, and of course our most popular plan. 80% of our users are on our top tier plan, which means that they need to raise as much money as humanly possible in the short period of time that they have for election day. But I will say one of my favorite parts of this job is the 4 times a year we get to send out emails to each one of our users with their quarterly ROI numbers.
Yeah.
So it's something like congratulations, you received an 850% return on your investment in Prospector Pro.
Right.
And I think communicating that value is important because it can be hard to understand the connection between the activity and the outcomes. But that's kind of how we approached our pricing journey.
One more thing before we wrap up the conversation. I'm always curious about the software apps and systems that people use to stay organized and on track. And I think other folks could learn from this as well. What do you and your team rely on to run Trailmapper today?
It's mostly the same, I would assume, the same sort of products that those companies at our stage are using. So Slack is big. All of our communication, internal communication lives there. Obviously, we're a fully distributed team, so that's kind of like that is the office in Slack. We use Notion for our wiki, our everything wiki. It houses our knowledge bank, all of our data and resources. We actually also use another app, SaaS product called Super, which turns Notion pages into web pages, which is how we publish our knowledge bank, both the internal and the external knowledge bank. So Notion is mission critical for us, and there's actually sort of a dependency there. So hopefully Notion doesn't go down anytime soon. We use Loom. Loom is a video recording software, and that's primarily used for recording tutorials, knowledge bank resources. Occasionally, it's used on the customer support side, but primarily used internally. Zapier, Retool are app connectors we use between different services, and just like everyone else, we're playing around with ChatGPT internally anyway for various tasks. DALL-E too on the marketing side, but it's not currently built into the user-facing app yet. But we are actively exploring opportunities to utilize, so-called generative AI for different services within the app. But stay tuned on that.
Well, that definitely endorse Notion, and Loom is great too. So if you haven't checked those out, be sure and give them a look. My thanks to Dante for another great conversation. As always, you can learn more about him and Trailmapper with the link in our show notes, and go back and listen to the first episode and kind of compare and contrast his journey thus far. If this episode made you a little bit smarter, gave you something to think about, all we ask is that you share it with a friend, because bonus, you look smart in the process as well. It's a great way for people to get to know our podcast, which, thanks to your help, is growing every week. Remember to subscribe to the Business of Politics show wherever you get your podcast. That way you will never miss an episode. You can also sign up for email updates at businessofpoliticspodcast.com. With that, I'll say thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.